Hey guys, welcome back to VT GeoChat, the podcast of the Department of Geosciences at Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Rose McRorty, and I'm joined today by our postdoc, Dr. Kristin Chilton. She is working with Dr. Jim Spatilla, and today we're going to talk about her paper, Dip Angle Controls on Plucking Susceptibility and Knickpoint Evolution in Bedrock Rivers. Oh,
Knick-knack evolution. I spent my PhD studying knick-knacks.
I love it. Knickpoint evolution.
Yes.
All right. But before we get into this paper about Knickpoint evolution, please make sure that you like this video, subscribe to our channel if you have not already, and guys, we have been doing this for weeks now. You should have subscribed already if you have not. And make sure that you have rung that little notification bell. Make sure that you never miss any of our episodes because our episodes are awesome. And clearly you are enjoying them because you keep coming back. So Kristin, can you go ahead and tell me about your paper?
Yes. So this paper was really fun to work on. This was my my postdoc with the civil engineering department. So they have a big lab over there with lots of flumes in it. A flume it's basically like a long skinny tank that you can run water through and simulate a river in a lab environment.
Right.
So
I was thinking of the rides that they have at the amusement park, but
yeah, well, you know,
that goes too.
Throw some rocks in there and run some experiments if you want to. So flumes are really fun to work with because they essentially let you scale down a river in space and in time, right? So you can see this thing that might be very large in real life and might change very slowly, and you can simulate it in the lab so that you can observe it kind of in real time. So the experiments that we were running were focused on trying to understand how the properties of bedrock that underlie a bedrock river impact the river's evolution. So in particular, we were focused on the fracture orientation or dip angle in probably the simplest terms, right? Everyone remembers strike and dip. So bedrock rivers are kind of one of the two end member types of rivers, right? You have alluvial rivers, which are the rivers typically found in like lower elevation environments that move sediment around. They're surrounded on their bed and banks by sediment that's kind of like more or less unconsolidated, and you know they're more mobile. Bedrock rivers you tend to find up at higher elevations, and these rivers are bound by bedrock, right? They're in contact with the material that's making up a continental landmass. So we care about bedrock rivers and how they evolve because they're ultimately one of the key drivers of change in a landscape. So like, you know, tectonics pushes a bunch of crustal material up at a high elevation, but it's erosion and sculpting by bedrock rivers that turns that mass of crust into mountains and valleys and canyons and stuff. So they're kind of a cool thing to study in that sense, right? Because they are responsible for creating the beautiful landscapes that we like to hike around in and such. But they also are the drivers of change over a lot of the Earth's surface. So if we want to understand how the landscape that we're looking at formed, how it might form in the future, how it might respond to a perturbation like a fall in sea level or tectonic uplift, we have to understand bedrock rivers. And to understand bedrock rivers, we have to understand how the bedrock impacts the river's evolution, right? So bedrock is complex in 3 dimensions, but also in time, like as you're exhuming material, you're exhuming different types of bedrock. So a lot of my work has been focused on understanding how different properties of the bedrock impact how it's eroded and how the river that's incising into it will evolve over time.
Right.
So that was a little bit of a
So if it's
tangent,
okay.
but back to the experiments themselves.
If it's okay, quickly, can I just ask you, when you say properties of the bedrock, are you talking about what type of rock is in the bedrock, or what do you mean by properties?
So a lot of different things can go into that. Usually we're thinking specifically about things like the tensile strength of the
Okay.
rock and the spacing of any fractures in it.
Okay.
The mineralogy of it and how susceptible those minerals are to weathering at the
Okay.
surface. Things like that are kind
Okay.
of the
All
big
right.
ones
Now I
when I
follow.
say bedrock properties. Yeah. So these experiments we're focused on understanding how dip angle or the orientation of any fracture in the rock, right? So bedrock is often fractured at, in some sort of regular pattern. Not always. Sometimes their fractures are just random. But if you're thinking about like layered sedimentary rocks or columnar basalts, often we see bedrock that kind of has some kind of fabric to it,
Okay.
right? So the fractures are in some regular orientation. Here in the Appalachians, we have a lot of folded kind of Paleozoic age siliciclastic rocks that are making up the mountains around here. And so those all have usually like dip angle that's continuous over like many kilometers. So in a landscape like that, how does the dip angle impact how the rivers that are eroding those mountains evolve? And a kind of key component of that is knickpoints. So knick-knacks. So a knickpoint is, you can kind of think of it as a waterfall. A lot of them are expressed as waterfalls. But it's basically just like a convexity along a river's profile that's normally like, normally smooth. Don't know if you can see that, but like a smooth, concave up profile. And then a knickpoint would be like, something like this along the profile.
Okay.
Right, so that can indicate either something that's like temporary, like a wave of incision that's moving through the landscape, or it can be an indicator of like more resistant bedrock that the river has to steepen in order to erode through.
Okay.
So knickpoints are kind of like these really interesting features that we focus a lot on in geomorphology because they tell us a lot about the landscape. They can like record climatic history or tectonic history, or just tell us how the river is interacting with the bedrock. So in the title of the paper, that's why knickpoint is in there, is we were simulating these in the lab. So what we did finally is we had a bunch of little tiles that I brought some tiles.
Oh, nice.
Fish these out of my pocket.
I love show and tell.
So, yes, these little tiny tiles that we stacked in the flume.
These same tiles.
These exact tiles. These are in a bucket in my garage right now because the experiments are over and I should make like a kitchen backsplash with them. But anyway, so little tiny tiles. These are like about a centimeter square.
They're cute.
And we stacked these in a much larger stack than this, to simulate layered bedrock. So think about like simplest case, flat-lying sedimentary rock that has some layers to it.
Okay.
Often it will have like perpendicular joint set, so perpendicular fracture network.
Okay.
So this does a really good job of simulating that. And what we did was stacked these at 3 different orientations. So orientation 1 is horizontal, right, flat line.
Okay.
And then we 3D printed some support trays, so just like plastic support trays that held them at a slight upstream dip or a slight downstream
Okay.
dip.
And so to clarify, upstream or downstream dip means that if you have this flat tile, it's pointing either downstream or upstream. Is
Yes,
that correct?
correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're simulating, sedimentary bedrock that is either flat lying, dipping downstream, or dipping upstream. And then we kind of let the flume run, right? We turn on the flume to some predetermined discharge that we've decided is a good one. And we let it evolve and we watch what happens. And it's really cool to watch. So these experiments took forever to set up. I think there was like 4,700 tiles in each experiment. So this was like, took forever setting them up by hand. Yes. So I had several undergraduates that were a gift to me, and they were really helpful in the prep for these experiments. We ran some other experiments too, which I'll talk about in a bit, that used fewer tiles, and those ones are a bit more repeatable. But anyways, so the main experiments were like these, I call them reach scale experiments, because a river reach is like, kind of the length of the river over which you can observe like larger scale features. So we're not talking about like 1 little meter of the river. A reach is usually like tens to maybe hundreds of meters, depending on how big your river is.
Okay.
So these are like reach scale experiments where we're looking at, some larger scale feature of the river, like a knickpoint, and we're seeing how they evolve. So you can either click on the link to the videos in the comments, or maybe Rose will magically make the videos appear here, but you should watch them because they're very cool.
Yes. And one way or another, if you do not see the video on the screen right now, it is in the description. Like I said, we are doing this as we go.
Yeah, but they're really cool because we're essentially simulating a process that would take, thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of years to occur in nature, right? Like removal of bedrock takes some time. It takes sometimes a really intense flooding event to occur. So it's not something that we can usually go and observe. You probably wouldn't want to be there at the time that it's happening anyways. So it's really cool to be able to simulate it in the lab. So what we were trying to figure out ultimately is, how does the orientation of the bedrock impact how erodible it is, and how does it impact the evolution of the channel bed, like the knickpoint. So with these reach scale experiments, we actually didn't see a difference in erosion rate. So we were measuring that by we were recording these, and then we would take screenshots and estimate based on the image the volume of tiles that had been eroded at different time intervals, so we could kind of get a time series of erosion and an erosion rate from that. So the erosion rate was actually pretty similar across all orientations, which was weird. And the reason why we thought that was weird is because our other experiments, which I haven't talked about yet, I guess now would be a good time. Our other experiments, which were focused more on trying to tease out the relative thresholds of erosion for a single block, so in these experiments we had a smaller tile stack, and only one row was free to erode, only the top row was free to erode. And we would turn on the flume and very slowly, very gradually ramp up the discharge, such that we could capture the initial motion, right? When the first block started to pluck.
So basically, how much does it take to make one tile move?
Right. What's the force required to initiate motion at that orientation? Okay. So we did that for all three orientations, and we found a very clear relationship to dip angle. The downstream dipping tiles. So if flow is coming towards me, it's flowing down the tile like that. These ones were the easiest to erode. Okay. And then the upstream dipping ones were actually, these were the hypotheses. I'll just continue because these were this is what I thought was going to happen. I thought the downstream one was going to be easiest to erode, because the vector that is parallel to the base of that block, the component of the gravity vector that's parallel to the base of that block, is aligned with the flow direction. Okay. Right. So I thought that would be the easiest one to erode. And then I thought that the upstream dipping orientation would be the most difficult because the opposite is the case. Okay. The component of gravity acting along the base of that block is acting in opposition to the flow direction. And then I thought the horizontal case would be somewhere in between. So basically,
just sorry not to cut you off, you're saying is that if the river's flowing this way and your block is dipping in the same direction, you're saying that both gravity pulling this down this way and the river pushing this way would make the block free. Exactly. And then in the other direction, it's pushing it, the gravity's kind of pushing against the river flow.
Yeah, it's kind of, right, it's kind of pulling it back upstream. So what I thought was going to happen is, downstream dipping would be easiest to erode, upstream dipping most difficult, and horizontal somewhere in between. What actually happened is that horizontal was very clearly much easier to erode than either of the other two orientations. Then upstream dipping was very clearly the easiest to erode, and then the downstream dipping orientation was pretty variable. Like sometimes it would erode at very low discharges, and sometimes it would take a lot of discharge,
I wonder where
very
that
high
is.
discharge to erode. So my guess is that the mechanism for how it erodes changes. Mm-hmm. So in both the horizontal case, I'll try to do this here. The horizontal case, your block is eroding by sliding, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's just kind of scooting, and then it usually flies away like this.
Okay.
In the upstream dipping case, it's also sliding, right? It's kind of scooting upstream, and then eventually it'll fly away.
Okay.
But in the downstream dipping case, you have another block here, right? Like the way that the blocks are held kind of by necessity means that they're supported at their downstream end. So instead of sliding, it has to pivot.
Right.
And that is a more energy intensive process. It's not as efficient. And I think it depends a lot more on like random variations in the flow.
Okay.
So anyways, we found like a very clear relationship between orientation and the threshold of erosion in these first experiments. But in the larger like reach scale experiments, we didn't see that show up. Yeah, we didn't see that expressed because I think what was more important is the deposition of tiles as they're eroding, acting to kind of shield a lot of the tiles that were still in place. It would also impact the flow structure by changing like the shape of the bed, and that was different for each orientation. So ultimately, the erosion rates were all pretty similar for each orientation, but they kind of had like different patterns of armoring by the eroded tiles, right? Like they would kind of pile up on top of the tiles that hadn't eroded yet and protect them, and that happened like most in the downstream case, meaning like that experiment spent the most time in this like armored state where nothing could happen until those tiles were eroded, and then the upstream dipping one spent very little time in that case. The tiles just weren't, they didn't collect as they did in the downstream dipping case on top of the tiles that were still in place, and then it was kind of moderate in the horizontal case. So ultimately, what governed like the evolution of the knickpoint ended up being not so much the orientation of the blocks directly, but more the flow dynamics, the dynamics of armoring by deposited tiles, and kind of the shape of the river, the bed forms that formed, that were indirectly affected by dip angle. So it kind of ended up having a much more complex impact on the evolution of the river than we expected.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty interesting, especially I would imagine if you live near a river.
Yeah.
You may be interested in knowing, what is the likelihood of,
right.
if you have a flood or something in this area where you live, then how likely is it to be catastrophic?
Yeah.
So that could see that being...
Right. So bedrock rivers, that's kind of like the practical side of this is we have a lot of infrastructure built around rivers, right? And in particular, you think of dams, and dam spillways even, if you're eroding a concrete slab, it's not that different from eroding a slab of bedrock. So whether you're talking about like erosion of the spillway itself or erosion of the bedrock surrounding the dam or like underneath it, undermining it, understanding how the properties of that bedrock in that specific scenario might impact how it erodes can be, really, really important in terms of a like disaster preparedness, infrastructure stability standpoint for sure.
Yeah, I can see how that would be.
Yeah.
So I have a couple questions for you, and this is more you wanted to say to this. I don't want to cut you off. But
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So my first question that I wanted to ask you actually is, what about the study is particularly a strong point for science? And this could be a conclusion that you draw, something that maybe you've done differently than other researchers have done, just anything that you think makes this paper stand out. I guess what I'm asking is, if someone is doing future research, why would they look to your paper and cite your paper?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I kind of think that the main strength of this study is that no one else has kind of done an experiment like this, primarily for practical reasons, right? Like, no one wants to stack 5,000 little blocks.
Oh, I don't know. You can find enough kids who like Legos, right?
I like, it is therapeutic, you put on like a podcast or good music or whatever and just knock it out, but like, it takes forever, right? So practically, it is not maybe the first method that a lot of people have jumped into, but we actually saw great comparison between like geomorphic features that we saw in the flume to natural rivers, local ones actually. So we're pretty confident that this does a good job modeling natural processes.
And when you say local, you mean local to Blacksburg?
Yes,
Okay,
right. So
perfect.
like in the Appalachian Valley and Ridge in Southwest Virginia. So we think it's a really good model, right? Like, it models bedrock erosion via plucking, which is this process where you're kind of removing discrete blocks of material, and so that means there's a lot we can learn from it, right? So a lot of river erosion experiments tend to focus on erosion via abrasion, which is when sediment being carried by the flow kind of gradually impacts and wears down the bedrock.
Like a sandpaper effect.
Yeah, right. Like,
thing.
super cool, really important process. But plucking kind of tends to, or has been historically, just not studied as much. So I think that there is a lot to learn. There are so many iterations we could do on these experiments. So yeah, I think it's like a particularly novel approach, and there is a lot of potential for like learning really cool things about how plucking dominated bedrock rivers erode.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Now, this isn't as much of a fun question to ask, and I know no scientist likes to have to be asked this, but what do you think about your study maybe could have gone better? This could be the research methods, your conclusions, your ability to draw conclusions from the data, time, resources, anything that you think just could have made the study stronger than it ultimately was.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I love it because it's important to know like how seriously should I take these results. So definitely a good question to ask. And for this study, it's like pretty obvious to me. The main limitation is that we only could do one of each of these types of experiments, right? Like, it would take like a month to get set up for each experiment. So we did 3 orientations, and we tested them each once. So that's 3 experiments. The other experiments, the like threshold ones, we repeated those a bunch of times. So those are more repeatable. We got more data from those. But for the larger scale ones, just for practical reasons, like, we couldn't do that more than once. We had to choose between repeatability or like testing more orientations. Right. So yeah, that's a huge limitation. Like, maybe the next time we did it would be totally different. Right. I don't think so, because when we're setting these up, we're doing a lot of practice runs, or we're setting up less tiles, fewer tiles than we did for the official experiments, and we would see how they would behave. And I'm pretty confident that our experiments were representative. They had consistent behavior to all of our test runs, but I would have loved to do kind of several more experiments if I had an army of undergrads and all the time in the world. I was also like very pregnant, so
fair enough.
My daughter was born like a week after I finished all these experiments.
Oh, wow.
So I didn't really have like a lot of extra time.
Yeah, you had a lot going on.
There were deadlines and practical limitations. But yeah, that's probably the main weakness of the study is the lack of repeatability.
Right. Well, I mean, in a way that's good, because that opens the door for more research.
There's a lot more
and
to
that
do.
actually leads to my next question, which is, what are the opportunities? I'll take a step back. What are the logical next steps for you as you're continuing the study? So you did this in civil engineering.
Yeah.
And now you've come home to geosciences. So we're very happy to have you back. So I was wondering, what are the logical next steps for continuing this particular study?
Yeah, so there are so many iterations that you could do on experiments like this. Like, I should have mentioned this. This is another limitation, is that, this isn't a perfect analog to nature. So in nature, you don't have tiles that are like, free to slide past each other. They're not completely detached in nature. Right. They have some fractures, but the fractures have strength to them, right? Like you have to, maybe hit it with another block that's already been plucked to like dislodge it. So, we could iterate on that. We could try different setups where we add something to add cohesion between the tiles so that they're not just like free to move, and see how the dynamics change. Like maybe the armoring that ended up being so important kind of goes away. I don't know. Right. So you can iterate on that. You can iterate on different types of layering, right? Like you'll see like thick sandstones interbedded with thinly bedded like chippy shales or something. So we could do interbedding experiments. We could do experiments where we add in
and interbedding being where you'd have shale sandstone, just as one example.
Yeah, that's what you see often in nature. So we could do experiments where we add sand and kind of see how if you add abrasion and plucking, which is what happens in natural rivers, like how do these interact? Do you enhance plucking by adding in sediment that could abrade? And then one thing that I really think would be cool is to incorporate these results into a numerical model and kind of explore the question of, like, at the landscape scale, how does this variation in erodibility impact the evolution of layered landscapes? Like here we see a lot of the ridges kind of have asymmetry where like the dip slope is shallower than the anti-dip slope. So maybe exploring questions like that, like can we partially explain that by erodibility within bedrock rivers? So yeah, those are just some ideas.
That's awesome. So I guess that kind of leads to the last question, which was, what opportunities do you see for other people who are interested? Maybe they've been listening to this podcast and they think, wow, that's so cool, that's what I want to study. Maybe college students looking at grad school, or even high schoolers looking at undergrad opportunities. What would be your do you think that there are good opportunities in this for study? Obviously at Virginia Tech, because you're here, but
come talk to me, definitely. But also, like, I think flume experiments are relatively easy to get into if you are motivated to build your own flume. Like you can do that for pretty cheap, like in our lab there's like a few flumes that people have just built like for various projects just out of like acrylic and plywood. We also have, expensive fancy research flumes, but like you can do good research on a flume made out of plywood and acrylic
that's pretty cool.
Costs like less than $1,000 and several trips to Home Depot to make.
Nice.
So like if you are interested, like, go find the professor at the university near you that does like fluid mechanics or whatever, and ask them if you can build your flume. But it's possible.
Right.
So yeah, I guess I would say that. But yeah, I don't know. Come talk to me too.
Yes, it sounds like we have opportunities at the very least for people who like Legos to stack tiles. So
absolutely.
Yes.
If you're willing to stack tiles, like I have experiments for you. So go for it.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. But thank you so much for being on the show. It's been great having you. It's been great learning about these knickpoints and these experiments. So guys, thank you so much for being here for this episode and for joining us today. Please stay tuned for our next episode.